Good morning. I'm going to pick up on some of the questions that we talked about last night as the meeting kicked off. I'm going to talk about questions of nationalism and state formation and how they relate to democracy, asking some of the questions that Dan has just asked as well. But I'm going to ask it through a particular story, a puzzle at least in the world of political science, that I'm going to pose for you. And that puzzle is why two countries that have largely similar historical, economic, and colonial inheritances look so different almost immediately after they gain colonial independence. And those two countries are India and Pakistan. So what you see here in this map, outlined in red, is British colonial India in 1939. And 8 years after this map is sort of drawn, these countries, or British India, is carved up into two sovereign successor states. And you see here in sort of dark pink, India, and in green, what is then West and East Pakistan, today, of course, Bangladesh. And the puzzle I'm really posing for you today that I think has some relevance, not just for these countries, but particularly for countries that in Asia have a colonial history, where much of the population of the world lives, where they don't have states and nations that have evolved over long, long stretches of time, but really have emerged in a fundamental sense in the last 100 years. In some respects, why do these two countries then so quickly, really within a decade after independence, diverge with respect to the core institutions of democracy? And the reason that this question is a puzzle is because the classic structural explanations for democracy that we have in political science don't really explain this divergence. And I think in some ways it's a really hopeful, this is not a story of you need 1,000 years of history to get democratic institutions. This is a story where you have a country that doesn't have that particular history and yet manages to create what is a messy but certainly a stable democracy. So these structural explanations don't really have much analytic purchase on the core puzzle that I just posed for you. So it's not just in ways political, however, that India and Pakistan have diverged. And what you see before you is that in 1950, from relatively similar starting points of income per capita, which is the first period in which I can get data that's largely comparable over time, they start from similar incomes per capita. And today, India is, in fact, quite a bit wealthier than Pakistan. Again, this is where the database ends. And that is not, this story of greater wealth in India, it's not just a story of a few people getting a lot wealthier. What you see here, has translated into substantial differences in human development in these two countries. So in some ways, these indicators are marginal in terms of life expectancy at birth or school enrollment, which you do see, again, India pulling ahead a little bit over time. But in some other domains, some of which are relevant to state capacity, a core, I think, question for the conference, is India is doing quite a bit better. And so then the question is, why does this come about? I mean, this is a story of divergence in not just ways political, but also economic. And I just want to, and my research really asks the question of how does this happen? So India's growth picks up really in the 1980s. And some of the work by the people in this room, like Subramanian and Roderick, Atul Kohli, among others, have argued that in the 1980s, India's government adopts a pro-business policy. This is not a Washington consensus neoliberal kind of set of policies, but it's really the government making a democratic, an internal decision to adopt a new set of policies that leads to growth takeoff. But what I argue, in my research, is that growth takeoff is actually predicated upon democracy being in place. that is not a military intervening in politics, not ethnic politics, fundamentally derailing decision making at the center. So again, the puzzle I pose is, why does this come about? And the economic and the political divergence is in some sense predicated on democracy emerging in that very first decade after independence. So if I'd shown you the polity 4 data scores that Dan showed you for the countries in Europe, they show also substantial divergence, not only in the level of democracy, but in the level of stability in these countries over time. So what's the answer here? So my research focuses on the kinds of elites that lead the nationalist movements in the critical few decades before independence emerges, before independence happens. And in the case of India, the nationalist movement, which is initially not a nationalist movement at all, it's a set of elites primarily interested in pursuing their own political and material advancement. And this group is, in a sense, has one foot in traditional Indian society, and at another leg, another foot straddles these two societies, has a foot in colonial institutions of power. They are graduates of colonial educational institutions. They're also primarily urban, they're primarily Brahmins, they're primarily lawyers. And it's this overlap of interests that leads them in 1885 to set up this organization called Indian National Congress that's at first not at all interested in advocating for democracy. It's just interested in opening up the institutions of government because that benefits them. And the same thing is true for what becomes the eventual independence movement of Pakistan. That is to say that it's set up by a Muslim landed aristocracy in 1905. They're not at all interested in independence initially. They're really interested in getting protected, reserved seats of power at the table of colonial government. So these are two sets of elites. They're interested in their own material advancement, but the historical conditions interact, and the imperatives of colonial rule interact to have them take two sets of decisions that I argue are really critical for whether democracy emerges, and then which I argue itself is critical for differential patterns of economic development over the longer term. Now you might ask, I think very legitimately, why do these two sets of elites organize? Why doesn't the Hindu landed aristocracy organize? Why aren't other groups organizing? And I'm not going to talk about kind of the big structural conditions, but I am going to just say that there are some conditions that I think make it more likely that these particular groups organize and not other groups. Okay, so they take two kinds of decisions that I argue are really important for democracy, emerging or not in one case. And the first decision is that they articulate different kinds of nationalist ideologies. So again, I think this harks back to some of the things that Frank Fukuyama was saying last night. They articulate a kind of creedal, highly inclusive, especially when you look across the post-colonial world at what independence movements are doing and saying about who is the we, who is the nation. They articulate highly inclusive conceptions with respect to the major social cleavages, with respect to caste, with respect to religion, with respect to language, with respect to the regional groups. It's a very highly inclusive conception of what the nation means. Whereas once the Muslim landed aristocracy, which is geographically concentrated, also ethnically distinct, and of course shares a religion, and it's the overlap of many of these social cleavages that leads this particular group to solve the collective action problem, as it were, and to advocate for themselves. But because they're essentially closely correlated, or they're embedded within the colonial power structure, it's really only 7 years before independence, in 1940, that they even begin to make claims to actually represent a nation. And at this late juncture, they essentially glob onto the only ideology which is effective at mobilizing groups that they can make a claim to represent, which is Muslims in the northwest and the northeast, those regions that become eventually Pakistan and then Bangladesh. And so they use the ideology of religion. And that, I argue, is a fundamentally exclusive ideology, because at independence, which at that time includes what is today Bangladesh, approximately 20% of the population is not Muslim. And that sets up, I think, a narrative of who's in and who's out that can be, that allows for certain kind of or makes certain kinds of democratic breakdown more likely. So that's the first decision. They articulate different conceptions of the nation. And the second decision is very similar to the arguments that Dan has made, that they organize different kinds of parties. And they do so because they're in fundamentally different positions with respect to the colonial government. So because the Muslim land aristocracy is in many ways supported by the colonial government, it does not take decisions to organize a strong political party. It doesn't create coherent coalitions. It doesn't create many of those key party organizations that Dan's already talked about in terms of infrastructure and being able to create consensus within the party. It doesn't create offices in the core regions that become the state. So for example, in India, what becomes India, there's a local congress for a local office for the nationalist movement in every district of India. And it's often very active. In the core regions of Punjab, the Punjab that becomes Pakistan, the part of Punjab that becomes Pakistan, in 6 districts there isn't an office that's active at all in the 7 years before independence. So it really creates a weak party organization along the dimensions of the core alliances it makes, the programmatic development, that is to say that what will the state do, what will the party do when it actually comes to power. And it's these two decisions that lead to quite differential outcomes in terms of democracy. So when you get independence from British colonial rule in August 14th for Pakistan and August 15th for India in 1947, the basis on which democracy or independence is granted provides for essentially a tentative democracy to be in place, because there were elections that were held at a regional level before independence. And it's that party that comes to power and that's tasked with setting up a constitution. But in the case of in India, you see that it was those programmatic commitments that had been set up in the decade prior to independence that was the basis for creating the Indian Constitution, which was already essentially finished in 1949, ratified in 1950. National elections get held in 1952. On the core issues that are quite difficult in constitution making, those issues had essentially already been worked out within the party before independence. So it's really the party that provides the basis for stability. But whereas in Pakistan, the party hasn't really forged much consensus about what it's going to do once independence happens. It's essentially, it's rallied support in regions of Western Punjab and Eastern Bengal, the primary regions that become Pakistan, by merging with existing political organizations that have very different sets of interests. And as a result, their different interests, which haven't been essentially worked out within the confines of a party organization, leads to derailing of democratic processes very early on. So the national government, for example, dismisses every state government within 4 years after independence. In 1953, you have the first incidents of martial law in one of Pakistan's biggest cities. In 54 and 55, the Constituent Assembly, which is tasked with coming up with the Constitution, is dismissed. And in 1958, in the 4 years before of which you've had 4 prime ministers cycle through power each with increasing rapidity, you get a military coup that ends this kind of tentative democratic experiment. So it's really the parties that are the different kind of focal points of stability or not. But that's really just the focus on stability. And I argue that it's very hard to make the case that it's really, that the economic interests of the elite within India's nationalist movement could really predict that it's a democracy. And to actually talk about why it's a stable democracy rather than another kind of regime, we really need to talk about the conceptions of the nation and the inclusive commitments that have been made in the nearly 3 decades before independence to a sort of broadly inclusive set understanding of the nation that leads it also at independence to adopt the core institutions of democracy, such as universal adult franchise. So that's essentially the core argument that addresses the puzzle that I set out in the beginning. And I'm not going to have time to talk about it, but I'm very briefly going to talk about what my current research agenda is, which is to look at the relationship between the conception of nation and regime outcome, not just in India and Pakistan, but in a broad set of countries across Asia. And as I think somebody already said, I'm a political scientist, and I think in 2 by 2s. So I've talked today about how India and Pakistan have different conceptions, different kinds of founding national narratives. And talked about how India was a relatively inclusive one that also did not embrace key social hierarchy of caste. And that I argue that thinking in this way about what the founding national narratives are, who is the we that the nation represents, and that founding narratives are particularly influential for understanding prospects of democracy across Asia. And this is some of the work that I've begun to do in thinking about some of the other countries and how they map onto this 2 by 2. So I'm happy to take questions about that. I'm in the very, very early stages of writing this book. So to conclude, I argue that although those structural conditions that Dan and I have both mentioned that abound in the political science literature for why we get a democracy, those of course do matter. But those conditions are not, they're not requirements, because we do see examples of countries emerging without these long stretches of history that is favorable. And I think what political science literature needs to take more seriously are these kinds of questions. That is, what kinds of elites led the nationalist movement and when relative to independence, using what type of nationalism and organizing their movements to what degree. And I will stop there.